She grabbed a stranger's horse in the middle of town and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. A widow, a silent, broken rancher who hadn't looked at the sky in 8 years, and a little boy clutching a rifle he didn't even know how to fire. She didn't ask for love, she asked for walls and a loaded gun. He didn't offer warmth, he offered survival, nothing more. But when a ruthless cattle baron came to collect a dead man's debts in blood, when her son was taken into a whiteout blizzard, the man who had locked his heart away in a fortress of ice discovered something more terrifying than any gunfight he had ever survived. He had something worth living for. Welcome to a channel where the West is wild, love is hard-earned, and every story reminds us that the fiercest hearts are the ones that have already been broken. This story reminds us that the walls we build to protect ourselves from grief are the same walls that keep us from truly living, and sometimes it takes a fearless woman and a child's laughter to finally tear them down. Subscribe and telling us what hit hardest. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The wind sweeping through Rust Valley tasted of dry dirt and the bitter promise of early snow. Silas Thorne stepped out of the rusted swinging doors of the Gold Dust Saloon, pulling the collar of his heavy canvas duster up against the October chill. He didn't look at the sky. He hadn't looked at the sky in 8 years. Not since the whiteout blizzard that had buried his wife, along with his soul, beneath 3 feet of ice. He stepped off the boardwalk, the silver spurs on his boots clinking a steady, solitary rhythm. From the saloon's porch, the mayor's daughter, Pearl, leaned against a post, flashing him a smile painted bright red. "Cold riding back to that fortress of yours all alone, Silas," she called out, her voice a syrupy drawl. "Could always stay in town tonight." Silas didn't break his stride. He tipped the brim of his Stetson, a gesture of reflex rather than courtesy, and kept walking. His hands, scarred and heavily calloused from years of punishing, relentless labor, reached for the reins of his black gelding tied to the hitching post. He was a man who had built his life into a fortress, both physically and mentally. He wanted nothing to do with the town, and less to do with the women in it. He was tightening the saddle cinch when the harsh, cracking sound of a whip splitting the air echoed down Main Street. Silas paused, his gloved hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle. Outside the Mercantile, a crowd was forming, keeping a wide, cowardly distance. 3 men on horseback had cordoned off the entrance. Silas recognized the brand on their horses immediately. The Broken Iron. Gideon Black's men. At the center of the dirt road stood a woman, Cora Vance. Silas knew her name the way you knew the names of the doomed in Rust Valley. She'd been a widow for a year, clinging to a piece of land that sat dead center on the only viable water route for Black's expanding cattle empire. A sack of flour hit the dirt at her feet, bursting open and painting the muddy road a stark, violent white. "Credit's dried up, Mrs. Vance," sneered Hutch, Black's lead enforcer. He leaned lazily over the horn of his saddle, a twisted cigar clamped in his teeth. "Mr. Black says if you can't pay the debts your dead husband left behind, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, you freeze. Might be easier to just sign the deed over now. Save us the trouble of burning that shack down with you in it." Cora didn't flinch. Her calico dress was worn thin at the elbows, and the hem was caked in mud, but her spine was as straight as a lodgepole pine. Her dark hair whipped around her face in the freezing wind. She didn't look at the ruined flower. She kept her eyes locked on Hutch, her jaw set in a line of pure, unadulterated defiance. But it wasn't Cora that made Silas's chest tighten. It was the boy standing half a step behind her. Leo, 7 years old, wearing a coat 3 sizes too big, shivering in the autumn wind. But the boy wasn't crying. His small, knuckle-white hands were wrapped around the barrel of a rusted hunting rifle that was taller than he was. It wasn't loaded. Silas could tell by the way the hammer was rusted shut. But the kid was ready to die holding it. A phantom ache throbbed in Silas's chest. The cold, the helplessness. The townspeople muttered, looking at their boots. Not a single man stepped forward. Gideon Black owned the sheriff, the bank, and the fear of every man in Rust Valley. Silas clamped his jaw shut. Not my fight, he told himself. He swung his leg up, settling his weight into the saddle. He gathered the reins, preparing to turn the gelding toward home. "I'll see you in hell before I sign my land over to a thief." Cora's voice rang out, clear and sharp, cutting through the wind. Hutch laughed, an ugly, grating sound. "Suit yourself, widow. It's going to be a long, cold winter." Hutch tipped his hat mockingly and spurred his horse. The 3 riders trotted past the mercantile, kicking mud onto the boardwalk. The crowd began to disperse, eyes averted, ashamed of their own silence. Cora stood in the street, staring down at the ruined flower. Then she looked up. Her eyes caught Silas's across the distance. Silas went still. He saw the calculation happening in her mind. He was the only man in the valley with a ranch fortified enough to withstand an assault from Gideon Black. He was also the most notoriously unreachable man in Colorado. Cora didn't hesitate. She didn't wipe the dirt from her cheek. She simply stepped over the spilled flour, grabbed her son's shoulder, and marched straight down the center of the street toward him. Silas tensed. His horse shifted nervously. Cora walked right up to the massive black gelding. She didn't look up with pleading eyes. She reached out with bare, dirt-stained hands and grabbed the leather of his bridle. The horse pinned its ears back, but Cora held firm, her knuckles white. She looked up at him. Her eyes were a storm of desperation, pride, and raw nerve. "You turned down the mayor's daughter," Cora said, her chest heaving, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You turned down the school teacher. You turned down every woman who tried to bring a pie to your doorstep for 8 years. Silas stared down at her, his face a mask of stone. "Let go of my horse, Mrs. Vance." "My husband left me with nothing but a target on my back," she continued, ignoring him entirely. Her grip on the bridle tightened. "Black is going to burn my cabin before the first snow. I need walls. I need a gun that doesn't jam." She paused, her breathing ragged, the freezing wind tearing at them both. "And you need someone to keep that mausoleum of yours from rotting into the ground." Silas narrowed his eyes. "I don't need anyone." "You're lying," Cora fired back, her voice cracking like the whip from earlier. She stepped closer, right into his space, refusing to be intimidated by his size or his legendary coldness. She looked him dead in the eyes. "You want a wife, or another winter alone, Silas Thorne?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silas looked at the fierce, beautiful, desperate woman holding his horse. Then his gaze drifted downward. Leo was standing beside his mother's skirt. The boy was shaking from the cold, his lips blue, still clutching that useless rifle with everything he had. The kid was looking up at Silas not with fear, but with a silent, desperate challenge of his own. 8 years of ice. 8 years of building a fortress just to sit alone in the dark. Silas felt the old scar tissue around his heart groan. He looked back down at Cora Vance. He didn't see a damsel in distress. He saw a survivor holding a match, asking if he was ready to burn the house down. Silas slowly uncurled his scarred fingers from his reins. He leaned forward over the saddle horn, his face inches from hers. "Tomorrow morning," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a visible shiver down her spine. "Bring your things. Don't expect a ceremony." Cora's breath hitched. For a second, her fierce mask slipped, revealing a flash of profound, staggering relief. Then she nodded once, let go of his bridle, and stepped back into the mud. Silas tipped his hat to her, turned his horse, and rode out of Rust Valley, leaving the town and the woman who had just altered the course of his life staring after him in the dust. The magistrate's office smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool. Outside, the town of Rust Valley watched through the frosted glass windows like vultures waiting for a carcass to drop. Silas stood rigid, his jaw clenched, staring at the inkwell on the scarred wooden desk. Beside him, Cora stood perfectly still. She wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen too many washings, and a wool shawl wrapped tight against the chill. "Do you, Silas Thorne, take this woman?" The magistrate rushed through the words, his eyes darting nervously to the heavy Colt revolver strapped to Silas's hip. Silas didn't say "I do." He simply gave a sharp, definitive nod. When it was Cora's turn, her voice didn't waver. "I do," she said, signing the ledger with a steady hand. It was a transaction written in ink and desperation. Silas paid the fee, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. Cora followed, pulling Leo along by the hand. They loaded her meager belongings, 2 battered leather trunks and a box of winter quilts, into the back of Silas's wagon. The ride to the Thorne Ranch was silent. The landscape shifted from the muddy tracks of town to rolling hills of dead golden prairie grass, eventually giving way to a jagged ridgeline. Nestled against the base of a towering granite cliff sat Silas's property. Cora stared at it as the wagon rattled over the frozen ruts. It wasn't just a ranch, it was a compound. The barn was built of thick, heavy timber. The corral fences were double reinforced. The main cabin was a sprawling, solid structure of dark pine, its windows narrow and shuttered, like the gun ports of a fort. "Go on inside," Silas muttered, hauling both of her heavy trunks out of the wagon bed with effortless, terrifying strength. Cora pushed open the heavy oak door. The air inside was freezing, smelling of cold ash and long-abandoned spaces. The cabin was large, but it felt like a graveyard. Every piece of furniture in the main sitting room, the sofa, the armchairs, the dining table, was draped in heavy white canvas sheets. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the shutters. Silas dropped the trunks on the floorboards with a heavy thud. He didn't look at the white sheets. "The back bedroom is yours," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that filled the empty room. "The boy can take the loft. There's a wood stove in the kitchen. There's enough chopped oak in the shed to last till spring." Cora pulled her shawl tighter, her eyes sweeping over the ghostly furniture. "And where do you sleep?" "By the front door," Silas replied flatly. "Always." He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the floorboards. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming, but Cora refused to step back. "Let's get the rules straight, Mrs. Thorne," Silas said, the new title sounding harsh and foreign in his mouth. "This is a survival pact, nothing more. You keep the fires lit, you feed the boy, you keep this place from falling to rot. I keep Gideon Black's men off your neck. You don't ask about my past, and I don't ask about yours. We don't share a bed. We don't pretend this is a romance." Cora met his icy stare. She slowly reached up and untied the knot of her shawl, letting it fall to a chair. Without a word, she walked past him to the center of the room. She grabbed the corner of the heavy white canvas covering the dining table and yanked it off. The dust billowed up in a cloud. She moved to the armchair, pulling that sheet off, too. "What are you doing?" Silas snapped, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I don't live in a mausoleum, Mr. Thorne," Cora said, tossing the canvas into a pile. "And I don't hide from ghosts." She turned to face him, her chest heaving slightly, her eyes blazing with an inner fire that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. "And let's get my rules straight," she continued. "I am not your maid, and I am not a dependent hiding behind your coattails. I am your partner in this fight. I know how to use a six-shooter, but that won't do me any good if Black's men shoot from the ridgeline." She pointed to the heavy lever-action Winchester rifle resting above the stone fireplace. "You're going to teach me how to shoot that," Cora demanded. Because if you take a bullet, I'm not letting my son die out here because I didn't know how to reload your gun." Silas stared at her. For 8 years, people had spoken to him in whispers and apologies. No one made demands. No one looked at him without flinching. Slowly, Silas walked to the fireplace. He pulled the heavy Winchester from its mounts, checked the chamber out of habit, and walked back to her. He held it out. "It kicks like a mule and pulls to the left in high wind," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave as he watched her small, capable hands grip the heavy wood stock. "Tomorrow at dawn. We start with targets at 50 yards. Cora held the heavy gun, her eyes locking onto his. 50 yards is fine for a start. I'll have the coffee ready." By the end of the second week, the Thorn Ranch had fundamentally changed. Silas was a man accustomed to silence, the profound, ringing silence of a solitary life. Now that silence was fractured. It was the smell of yeast and baking bread hitting him when he walked in from the cold. It was the sight of a small pair of boots lined up neatly next to his massive, mud-caked ones by the door. It was the low, melodic hum of Cora's voice as she swept the floorboards. It was driving him out of his mind. He found himself lingering in the barn longer than necessary, brushing down his gelding until the horse's coat shone like polished obsidian. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the cabin windows, looking for the flicker of lamplight, looking for her silhouette. "You're holding it too tight." Silas stood in the freezing yard, his breath pluming in the crisp autumn air. Leo was struggling with a wood-splitting maul that was far too heavy for a 7-year-old. The boy had been out here for 20 minutes, stubbornly trying to split a thick oak log, refusing to ask for help. Silas stepped up behind the boy. "Let the weight of the iron do the work, kid. You're trying to muscle it. You don't have the muscle." Leo looked up, his cheeks flushed with cold and embarrassment. He offered the handle to Silas. "No," Silas said, stepping closer. "Your chore, your swing. Slide your top hand down the handle as it falls. Like this." Silas reached around the boy, his massive, scarred hands covering Leo's small ones, guiding his grip. The sudden, unfamiliar sensation of a child leaning into him, trusting his physical strength, hit Silas like a physical blow. He swallowed hard, adjusting the boy's stance. "Now, swing." Leo brought the maul down. The wood cracked perfectly in two. The boy's face lit up with a grin so bright it rivaled the morning sun. "I did it." Silas stepped back quickly, clearing his throat, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets. "Stack it by the door," he muttered, turning hastily toward the cabin. He pushed through the front door, seeking the quiet of his own space, only to find Cora at the kitchen table. She had a tin basin of steaming water in front of her, and her hands were plunged into it, scrubbing furiously at his heavy canvas work shirt. Silas stopped dead in his tracks. "What are you doing?" Cora didn't look up, scrubbing a grease stain with a block of lye soap. "Washing your shirt. It smelled like horse sweat and gun oil." "I wash my own clothes," Silas said, his voice sharper than he intended. "You rinse them in the creek and leave them to freeze," Cora retorted, finally looking up, wiping a stray strand of dark hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "That's not washing. Take it off." Silas blinked. "Excuse me?" "The shirt you're wearing," she said, nodding to his flannel. "It's missing 2 buttons and the collar is frayed. Take it off. I'll mend it while this one dries." "I don't need you mending my clothes, Cora. And I don't need you looking like a feral mountain man when you're sitting at my dinner table," she fired back, her hands on her hips, the soapy water dripping from her fingers. Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides. He reached out to grab the wet canvas shirt from the basin, intending to take it back. Cora reached for it at the exact same moment. His massive, calloused hand clamped down directly over hers. Time stopped. The water in the basin went still. Silas froze, acutely aware of the searing heat of her wet skin beneath his rough palm. He hadn't touched a woman, truly touched one, in 8 years. The jolt that shot up his arm was electric, bypassing his logic and striking straight at the base of his spine. Cora's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide, the defiance melting into something softer, far more dangerous. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, suffocating sexual tension. Silas looked down at her lips, slightly parted, and felt a brutal, primitive urge to drag her against him and bury his hands in her dark hair. He yanked his hand back as if he'd been burned by the stove. "Leave the damn shirt," Silas ground out, his voice a low, ragged rasp. He spun around and stormed out the front door, leaving Cora standing over the basin, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark by the front window, his Winchester resting across his lap, listening to the wind howl through the canyon. He was losing his grip. The walls he had built were crumbling, and the woman sleeping in the back room was the earthquake. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the jagged peaks, Silas heard it. A sharp, frantic whinny from his gelding in the corral. Then, the heavy thud of hooves galloping away down the frozen dirt road. Silas was out the door in a second, the rifle leveled to his shoulder. The yard was empty. The morning air was dead still, the frost biting at his face. But as he stepped onto the porch, his boot hit something soft. Silas looked down. His blood ran instantly to ice. It was a burlap sack soaked through with dark, freezing blood. Sticking out of the top was the matted, lifeless head of Cora's sheepdog. Driven deep into the wooden porch floorboards, right through the dog's leather collar, was a heavy Bowie knife. Pinned beneath the blade was a piece of parchment. Silas pulled the knife free. He unfolded the note, his eyes scanning the crude, heavy handwriting. "You married his debts, Thorne, and we're coming to collect. G. Black." Silas crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles turning white. The slow-burn domestic peace was over. The war for Rust Valley had just arrived at his front door. Silas didn't let Leo see the dog. Before the sun fully crested the ridge, Silas had wrapped the shepherd's stiffening body in the bloody burlap and buried it behind the farthest corral. He drove the spade into the freezing earth with a cold, methodical fury. His jaw locked so tight, his teeth ached. When he walked back into the cabin, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon hit him. It was a domestic peace that felt like a mockery against the violence resting in his coat pocket. Cora was at the stove, her dark hair braided loosely down her back. She turned, offering a small, tentative smile that died the second she saw his face. Silas didn't speak. He reached into his duster, pulled out the crumpled, blood-stained parchment, and slammed it flat onto the pine dining table. "What debts, Cora?" His voice was a dangerous, quiet rumble. Cora wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer. She looked down at the note, all the color drained from her face, leaving her skin as pale as the winter frost outside. Her hand trembled as her fingers hovered over Gideon Black's heavy scrawl. "Where is Buster?" she whispered, looking around for the dog. "Buried," Silas said flatly. "I need an answer, Cora. Now." Cora closed her eyes. A shudder racked her slender frame, but when she opened her eyes again, the fear was gone, replaced by a deep, suffocating shame. She untied her apron with jerky, frantic movements and threw it onto a chair. "My husband," she began, her voice brittle. "Thomas. He wasn't just a failed rancher. He was a gambler. A desperate, foolish gambler." She paced to the window, unable to look Silas in the eye. He played in Black's back rooms. He lost everything. The livestock, the savings, the seed money. He told me he was going to turn it around. Then they found him dead in a ravine with his neck broken. They called it a riding accident. She turned to face Silas, her eyes bright with unshed tears and burning humiliation. "I thought Black just wanted my land for the water rights. I didn't know Thomas still owed him. I didn't know he'd tracked the debt to me." Silas watched her. He didn't see a liar. He saw a woman who had been carrying a crushing weight all by herself. "I brought a curse to your door," Cora said, her voice cracking. She marched past him, heading straight for the back bedroom. "Leo, pack your bag." Silas moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He crossed the room in 2 strides and planted his massive frame in the doorway of the bedroom, completely blocking her path. Cora grabbed the lid of her leather trunk and tried to haul it open. "Get out of my way, Silas. I won't drag you into a blood feud over my dead husband's gambling markers. I won't let Black burn this place down because of me." "Leave the trunk," Silas ordered. "I said move!" Cora shoved at his chest with both hands. It was like pushing against a granite boulder. She hit him again, her composure finally shattering. "Let me go, you don't owe us this." Silas caught her wrists. He didn't squeeze, but his grip was an immovable iron band. He pulled her hands away from his chest and stepped into her space, forcing her to look up at him. The air between them crackled. Her chest heaved, her breath catching in her throat as she stared into his pale, icy blue eyes. The sheer intensity in his gaze pinned her in place. "You stood in the dirt in the middle of town," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce rasp. "And you asked me if I wanted to spend another winter alone." Cora swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas let go of her wrists, his hands dropping to his sides, though he didn't step back. "I said no, and I meant it. You stay." Cora stared at him, the silence stretching taut between them. The shame melted away, replaced by a profound, terrifying vulnerability. For the first time in a year, someone was standing between her and the wolves. "Now," Silas muttered, breaking the tension as he turned back toward the main room, checking the cylinders of his twin Colt revolvers. "Keep the boy away from the windows tonight. Black sent a message. He'll be back for an answer." The attack didn't come with a roar. It came with a whisper. It was past midnight. The moon was a sliver of silver behind heavy, bruised clouds. Silas sat in the pitch-black sitting room, a lit cheroot clamped in his teeth, his Colts resting on his thighs. Then he heard it, the metallic snip of heavy wire cutters, followed by the groaning creak of a wooden fence post being violently unseated from the frozen earth. Silas stood. He moved through the dark cabin with the silent, predatory grace of a cougar. He didn't go out the front door. He slipped through the kitchen, out the back pantry door, and melted into the shadows of the barn. Down by the southern perimeter, 4 riders were tearing down his fortified corral fence, tossing the heavy timber aside to open a breach straight to the house. Silas stepped out from the shadow of the barn, 30 yards away. He thumbed back the hammers of both Colts. In the dead quiet of the night, the double click-clack sounded like a cannon cocking. The 4 riders froze. "You boys are trespassing," Silas called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the cold wind. The lead rider struck a match, lighting a cigar and illuminating his own face. It was Hutch. "Just doing some remodeling, Thorne," Hutch sneered, resting his hand on the butt of his sidearm. "Mr. Black figures if you're taking on Vance's debts, he's entitled to some of your property as collateral, starting with your prize gelding. We can do this easy, or we can leave you bleeding in the snow." Silas didn't flinch. 4 against 1 in the dark were bad odds, but Silas had lived a life where bad odds were the only kind he got. He calculated the spread. He could drop Hutch and the man to his left before the other 2 cleared leather. He'd take a bullet, maybe 2, but they'd all die. Silas began to raise his Colts. Crack! The explosive roar of a rifle tore through the valley, echoing off the granite cliffs like thunder. A split second later, Hutch's Stetson was violently ripped from his head, spinning into the dirt. Hutch yelled, his horse rearing up in panic. The other 3 men scrambled for their reins, their guns forgotten as their horses danced frantically. Silas didn't turn around, but he knew exactly where the shot had come from. "Next one takes off your ear, Hutch," a woman's voice rang out. From the second-story loft window of the cabin, the moonlight caught the long, blued steel barrel of Silas's Winchester. Behind it stood Cora, her silhouette framed by the window, the lever action mechanism clacking loudly in the night as she racked a fresh round into the chamber. 50 yards, Cora called out, her voice entirely devoid of fear. "Just like you taught me, Mr. Thorne." Hutch stared at the cabin window, then down at his ruined hat in the dirt. He realized in a sickening instant that this wasn't a solitary, depressed rancher anymore. This was a fortified compound with a marksman covering the high ground. "You're making a mistake, Thorne," Hutch yelled, fighting to control his horse. "Black won't let this go." "Tell Black to send men next time," Silas growled. "Get off my land." Hutch cursed, spurred his horse, and the four riders galloped frantically back down the road, disappearing into the dark. Silas stood in the freezing yard for a long moment, listening to the hoofbeats fade. Slowly, he uncocked his Colts and slid them back into their holsters. He turned and looked up at the second-story window. Cora was still standing there, the heavy rifle resting easily in her grip. The wind whipped her loose hair around her face. She looked down at him, a fierce, protective warrior standing guard over their home. Silas felt a profound, heavy shift in his chest. It wasn't just desire anymore. It was an overwhelming, terrifying surge of respect. He had married her for survival. But as he looked up at her in the moonlight, Silas Thorne realized with a jolt of panic that he was dangerously close to falling in love. The first real snow of the season didn't fall. It was driven like white nails into the hardened earth of Rust Valley. For 3 days following the midnight breach, Silas worked like a man possessed. He slept in 2-hour stretches, prowling the perimeter of the ranch with his Winchester in the dark, and spent the daylight hours fortifying everything that could be kicked, burned, or broken. The temperature plummeted. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. Up on the roof of the main barn, Silas was wrestling a heavy, pitch-soaked canvas tarp over a weakened section of shingles. The wind tore at him, freezing the sweat to his brow. His muscles screamed in protest. He hadn't eaten since dawn, running on nothing but black coffee and a dark, churning adrenaline. Gideon Black was coming back. Silas knew it in his marrow. He leaned over the steep pitch of the roof to reach a loose rafter. As he threw his weight against the heavy crossbeam to nail it flush, the frozen wood groaned. Crack! The rafter splintered under the immense pressure. A jagged, foot-long shard of hardened oak snapped back like a whip, driving straight through the thick canvas of his coat and burying itself deep into the meat of his left shoulder. Silas let out a harsh, guttural grunt. He didn't fall, gripping the roof edge with his good arm, his boots scrambling for purchase on the icy shingles. Breathing heavily, his vision spotting black, he reached over, clamped his gloved hand around the bloody wood, and ripped it out in one violent motion. Blood immediately surged, hot and fast, soaking his shirt and steaming in the freezing air. Silas cursed, climbing down the ladder with clumsy, heavy steps. He bypassed the cabin entirely. The last thing he wanted was Cora fussing over him. He staggered into the dim, quiet sanctuary of the barn's tack room, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. He shucked his heavy duster, his teeth gritted against the tearing pain. His flannel shirt was ruined, stuck to his skin with a spreading crimson stain. He grabbed a relatively clean rag from a workbench and clamped it awkwardly over his shoulder, leaning his head back against the rough pine wall, waiting for the bleeding to slow. The barn door creaked open. "Silas?" Cora's voice cut through the shadows. She had a wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders and a steaming tin mug of coffee in her hand. She stopped dead in the doorway of the tack room. Her eyes dropped to the blood dripping onto the dirt floor. The mug clattered to the ground, spilling hot coffee over the straw. "I'm fine," Silas growled immediately, turning his body to hide the worst of it. "Go back to the house." "You are a terrible liar," Cora said. She didn't scream and she didn't run. She crossed the room, her face pale but her hands terrifyingly steady. She reached for the bloody rag. Silas flinched away. "Cora, I said leave it." "Sit down on that crate before you pass out, and I have to drag your 200-pound carcass to the cabin," she ordered, her voice brooking absolutely no argument. Silas glared at her, but the edges of his vision were graying. Slowly, heavily, he sank onto the overturned apple crate. Cora didn't hesitate. She grabbed a pair of heavy shears from the workbench and began cutting away the blood-soaked flannel of his shirt, peeling the fabric back to expose his shoulder. Silas inhaled sharply through his teeth, the cold air hitting his bare skin. Cora froze. It wasn't the wound that made her breath hitch. It was the landscape of the man beneath the clothes. Silas Thorne's chest and shoulders were a map of brutal, unforgiving survival. There were burn scars, jagged white lines from barbed wire, and the unmistakable puckered entry mark of an old bullet wound on his ribs. He was heavily muscled, carved from years of breaking wild horses and hauling timber. But the scars told a story of a man who threw himself into harm's way because he didn't value his own life. She swallowed the lump in her throat, dipping a clean cloth into a bucket of icy water near the door. "This is going to sting," she murmured. "Do it." She pressed the wet cloth to the jagged gash. Silas's entire body went rigid, his jaw locked, the muscles in his neck cording like steel wire, but he didn't make a sound. Cora stood directly between his spread knees to get the leverage she needed to clean the wound. The forced proximity was sudden and suffocating. The tack room smelled of old leather, copper blood, and the clean, soapy scent of her skin. She leaned closer, her focused, dark eyes tracing the edges of the cut. "It's not deep enough for stitches, but it needs binding. Hold still." Her cold fingers brushed against the fever-hot skin of his collarbone. A tremor ripped through Silas that had absolutely nothing to do with the pain. He looked down at her. She was so close he could see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. He watched the way her dark eyelashes fluttered as she concentrated, the slight part of her lips as she breathed. She was fierce enough to shoot a man's hat off in the dark, yet gentle enough to patch him back together in a freezing barn. The walls Silas had spent 8 years building didn't just crack. They shattered into dust. "Cora," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the wind outside. She stopped, her hands resting lightly on his bare chest. She looked up. Her eyes met his, and the air in the tiny room evaporated. The space between them hummed with a violent electric tension. She didn't pull back. Her gaze dropped to his mouth, her breathing turning shallow and fast. Silas didn't think. The primitive, desperate need inside him overrode every vow of solitude he had ever made. His massive, uninjured right hand came up, his calloused fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. He pulled her down, and she met him halfway. His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of adrenaline, copper, and the bitter tang of coffee. Silas kissed her like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. He pulled her flush against his chest, groaning low in his throat as Cora's hands flew up to grip his shoulders, her fingers digging into his healthy muscles. She kissed him back with matching frantic intensity, opening her mouth to him, completely surrendering to the heat they had been fighting for weeks. For a few blinding seconds, the cold was gone. The ghosts were gone. There was only the searing heat of her mouth, the soft weight of her body against his, and the sudden, terrifying realization that he was entirely hers. And then, the wind slammed against the barn doors. The heavy wood rattled violently on its iron hinges, a sound like a booming crack of thunder. A blast of freezing air slipped through the cracks. The cold, the snow, the silence. The memory of his first wife's frozen face flashed behind Silas's eyelids with sickening clarity. The paralyzing guilt hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. "You don't get to have this. You let her die." Silas tore his mouth away from Cora's. He shoved himself backward, the crate scraping harshly against the dirt floor. He hit the wall, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and dilated as he stared at her. Cora stumbled back a step, her lips swollen, her eyes wide and dark with confusion and bruised desire. She reached a hand out toward him. "Silas?" "Don't," he choked out. The word was rough, defensive, like a cornered animal. He grabbed the clean bandage from her hand, pressing it clumsily to his own bleeding shoulder. He couldn't look at her. The shame and the panic were too heavy. "This was a survival pact," Silas said, his voice trembling with the effort to force it back into its cold, lifeless register. He stared at the dirt floor. "I told you, we don't pretend this is a romance." Cora stood frozen in the center of the tack room. The warmth that had just flooded her veins turned instantly to ice. The rejection was a slap to the face. She slowly lowered her hand, her posture stiffening, her pride rushing back in to shield her wounded heart. "Right," Cora whispered, her voice tight and brittle. "A survival pact." She turned around, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and walked out of the tack room into the freezing wind without looking back. Silas slid down the rough pine wall until he hit the dirt floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder in the dark, more alone than he had ever been in his life. The silence in the thorn cabin the next morning was not the quiet of a peaceful snowfall. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a drawn gun. Silas sat at the head of the long pine table, his left arm bound tightly against his chest beneath a fresh flannel shirt. The wound in his shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the pounding in his temples, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing hollow in his gut. He stared into his black coffee, watching the dark liquid ripple as the wind outside battered the heavy wooden shutters. Cora stood at the cast-iron stove, her back to him. Her movements were sharp, precise, and utterly devoid of the warmth that had begun to thaw the edges of his lonely existence. She cracked an egg into the cast-iron skillet, the loud hiss of grease the only sound in the room. She wore her hair pulled back in a severe, tight knot at the nape of her neck, the exact spot where Silas had buried his hand the night before. He closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "Coward," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. "You kissed her like a dying man, and then you threw her back to the wolves." The guilt over his late wife's death had been his constant companion for 8 years. It was a familiar freezing weight. But this new guilt, the knowledge that he had bruised Cora's pride and crushed the fragile trust they had built, burned like acid. "Cora," Silas rumbled, his voice rougher than usual. "Breakfast is ready, Mr. Thorne," she interrupted smoothly, not turning around. She slid the eggs onto a tin plate and brought it to the table, setting it down in front of him with a decisive clack. She didn't look at his face. Her eyes remained fixed on the scarred wood of the table. "Leo is in the barn checking the water troughs. I'll be mending in my room until noon. Cora, look at me." She straightened, her spine rigid, and finally met his gaze. Her dark eyes were completely shuttered. The fierce, passionate woman from the tack room was gone, replaced by the pragmatic, battle-hardened widow who had stopped his horse in the middle of town. "We have an arrangement, Silas," Cora said, her voice perfectly level, though he could see the faint, betraying tremor in her hands before she hid them in the folds of her apron. "You made the terms very clear last night. I assure you I won't forget them again. We are surviving. That is all." Before he could find the words to navigate the minefield he had laid, the heavy oak front door banged open. A blast of freezing air and a flurry of white snowflakes swept into the cabin. Silas was out of his chair in an instant, his right hand dropping instinctively to the Colt at his hip, ignoring the tearing pain in his stitched shoulder. It wasn't Gideon Black's men. It was just the wind, but the doorway was empty. "Leo," Cora called out, moving quickly toward the door. "Leo, close the door, you're letting the cold in." No answer. Silas stepped past her onto the porch, his eyes scanning the yard. The snow had started falling in earnest an hour ago, dusting the hard-packed earth with a treacherous layer of slick white powder. The corral gate, which Silas had distinctly told the boy to latch, was swinging wildly in the wind, its iron hinges squealing a protest. "Leo!" Cora stepped out onto the porch beside Silas, wrapping her arms around herself against the biting wind. "Where is he?" Silas's eyes narrowed, tracking the disturbed snow near the gate. "The yearling, the roan calf, it's not in the pen." He walked down the porch steps, crouching near the swinging gate. The tracks were faint, already filling with fresh blowing snow. Small boot prints, no larger than a man's palm, overlapping the frantic scattered hooves of a spooked calf. "He went after it," Silas said, his voice tightening. He stood up, looking toward the jagged, timbered ridgeline that bordered the eastern edge of the property. He took a halter and went after the calf. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Cora's features. "Alone? Into the timber?" Silas, the temperature is dropping. If he gets lost in those woods... If he gets lost, he freezes. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, a terrifying echo of Silas's own past. He won't, Silas said. The absolute certainty in his voice wasn't just to comfort her. It was a vow. He turned on his heel, striding toward the tack room. "Get your heavy coat, Cora. Your boots. Bring the Winchester." Within 10 minutes, they were mounted. Silas rode his massive black gelding, ignoring the searing pain in his left shoulder as he held the reins, while Cora rode a sturdy dun mare, the heavy rifle strapped to her saddle horn. They rode in silence, the emotional chasm between them temporarily bridged by the sheer, desperate necessity of finding the boy. The Rust Valley landscape in winter was not just unforgiving, it was actively hostile. The wind shrieked through the canyons, tearing the dead leaves from the scrub oaks and driving the snow horizontally into their faces. The temperature was plummeting fast enough that Silas could feel the moisture freezing in his lungs with every breath. "The tracks veer north here," Silas shouted over the wind, pointing down from his saddle to a slight depression in the snow leading toward a dense thicket of blue spruce. Cora nudged her mare forward, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. She wasn't crying. Silas admired that about her. In the face of terror, Cora Vance didn't break down. She geared up. They pushed through the timber line, the dense canopy of the evergreens providing a brief, eerie respite from the howling wind. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the crunch of their horses' hooves breaking the crust of the snow. Silas kept his eyes glued to the ground, reading the subtle signs of passage. A snapped twig here, a scuff on a frosted granite boulder there. Leo was a smart kid, but he was 7, and he was dragging a heavy leather halter through rough country. After an hour of painstaking tracking, the terrain shifted drastically. The dense timber opened up abruptly, giving way to a jagged, treacherous scar in the earth known to the locals as Dead Man's Gulch. It was a massive dry wash, carved out by centuries of flash floods, its steep walls lined with unstable shale, jagged limestone teeth and tangled roots. At the bottom, 50 feet down, a narrow frozen creek bed wound its way through the shadows. Silas pulled his gelding to a sharp halt at the edge of the precipice, holding up a hand. Cora stopped beside him. "What is it? Did you lose the trail?" Silas pointed downward. "He went into the gulch." Cora gasped, sliding out of her saddle before her horse had even fully stopped. She rushed to the edge, dropping to her knees on the frozen earth, peering over the steep, crumbly drop-off. "Leo!" she screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the canyon walls. "Leo!" Only the wind answered. Silas dismounted, grabbing a coil of hemp rope from his saddlebags. "The trail slid here. See the gouge in the dirt? He lost his footing." Cora's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh, God! If he fell—" "He didn't fall all the way. The slide stops on that terrace about 20 feet down," Silas said, tying one end of the rope around a sturdy pine tree with practiced rapid movements. "I'm going down. Stay here and cover the ridge with the rifle. If Black's men are tracking us—" "I'm not waiting up here while my son is down there," Cora interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. She grabbed the rope. "I'm going with you." Silas looked at her. Her eyes were blazing, fueled by a mother's sheer terrifying adrenaline. He didn't argue. He nodded once. "Follow me. Keep your weight back. Don't trust the shale." Silas went first, wrapping the rope around his good arm, rappelling down the treacherous near-vertical slope. The rocks crumbled beneath his boots, sending showers of pebbles and snow down into the dark belly of the gulch. Despite the freezing cold, sweat broke out on his forehead, as his injured shoulder screamed in agony with every shifting movement. He hit the terrace, a wide, flat shelf of rock overhanging the main canyon floor. "Leo!" Silas bellowed. "Mr. Thorne?" The voice was small, shaky, and came from the shadows of a deep, natural fissure in the rock wall, slightly obscured by the dead, skeletal roots of a fallen juniper tree. Cora hit the ground beside Silas a second later. Leo! She scrambled over the icy rocks, tearing the dead branches away with her bare hands. Silas stepped in, grabbing the heaviest root and heaving it aside with a grunt of exertion. Tucked inside the shallow cave, shivering violently but entirely unharmed, sat Leo. The missing roan calf was wedged in beside him, equally miserable but safe. "Leo?" Cora dropped to her knees, dragging the boy out of the crevice and crushing him against her chest. She buried her face in his frozen hair, finally letting out a fractured sob of relief. "You foolish, brave boy. What were you thinking?" "I'm sorry, Mama," Leo chattered, his teeth clicking together. "The gate banged open. I tried to catch him, but he ran fast, and then I slipped on the rocks, and we slid down here. I couldn't climb back up because the dirt kept falling." Silas crouched down beside them. He checked the boy's limbs with quick, efficient hands. No broken bones, no frostbite yet, though his fingers were frighteningly pale. "You did the right thing finding shelter, kid," Silas said, his voice remarkably gentle as he unbuttoned his heavy canvas duster and wrapped it entirely around the boy's shivering shoulders. "But next time you come get me, you don't take on the mountain alone. Understand?" Leo nodded, his eyes wide as he looked at Silas. "Yes, sir." Then the boy squirmed in his mother's arms, pointing back into the dark recess of the cave. "Mr. Thorne? I found something in the dirt." Silas frowned. He struck a match against the sole of his boot, shielding the tiny flame with his cupped hand, and leaned into the fissure. Half buried in the dry, powdery dust at the back of the cave was a rectangular object. It wasn't natural stone or wood. Silas reached in and pulled it out. It was a heavy iron lockbox. It was severely rusted, coated in years of grime and dirt, and secured with a heavy brass padlock. Stamped onto the lid, barely visible through the rust, was the emblem of the Denver First National Bank. Cora stared at it. "What is that doing down here? Did someone drop it?" "Nobody drops a bank box in a dead-end gulch by accident," Silas murmured. He set the box on the flat rock of the terrace. He pulled his heavy Bowie knife from his belt. "Silas, we need to get Leo back to the fire," Cora urged, eyeing the darkening sky. "We will. Just give me 5 seconds." Silas jammed the thick steel blade of the knife into the hasp of the rusted padlock. He brought the heel of his heavy boot down on the handle with a vicious stomp. With a harsh snap, the rusted brass lock shattered. Silas pulled the hasp free and flipped the heavy iron lid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, lay a thick leather-bound ledger. Beneath it were several bundles of paper, tied with rotting twine. No gold, no gambling markers, just paper. Silas carefully unfolded the oilcloth and pulled out the ledger. He flipped open the cover. The handwriting inside was meticulous, lined up in neat, obsessive rows. Dates, names, brands, and dollar amounts. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing. Then he turned to the second. His blood ran cold. "Cora," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. "Whose handwriting is this?" He held the open ledger out to her. Cora leaned forward. Her eyes tracked over the elegant, slanted cursive. She froze, the breath leaving her lungs in a sharp rush. "That's Thomas's handwriting," she whispered, staring at the book as if it were a rattlesnake. "That's my husband's script." Silas looked down at the bundles of paper beneath the ledger. He pulled one out, breaking the twine. They were Pinkerton Detective Agency reports, bank drafts, and letters, several letters bearing the official seal of the Colorado governor's office, addressed to the state marshal, but never sent. "He wasn't a gambler, Cora," Silas said, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. He turned the ledger around so she could see the columns. October 4th, 300 head broken iron brand, rerouted to Cheyenne. November 12th, Sheriff Miller payoff, $500 gold. December 1st, Mayor Vance payoff, land deed transfer. "This is a rustling ledger," Silas explained, the massive, horrifying puzzle pieces snapping violently into place in his mind. "Gideon Black isn't just a cattle baron squeezing out small ranchers. He's running the biggest, most organized cattle rustling syndicate in the territory. He's stealing herds from the northern ranges, rebranding them in the gulches and selling them across state lines. And he's buying the law in Rust Valley to cover his tracks. Cora stared at the pages, her mind reeling. But why did Thomas have this? Why did he hide it here? Silas looked at the unsent letters to the marshals, then up at Cora. The truth was ugly, and he hated that he was the one who had to tell her. Because he found out, Silas said softly. Thomas stumbled onto Black's operation. Maybe he found the rebranded cattle in this very gulch, but instead of taking it to the federal law right away, Silas tapped the ledger. He kept records. He gathered proof, and he tried to use it. You think he was blackmailing Gideon Black? Cora breathed, the horror dawning in her eyes. I think Black is a man who doesn't like being squeezed, Silas replied grimly. Thomas tried to extort a killer. That's why he ended up at the bottom of a ravine with a broken neck. Black didn't kill him over a gambling debt. He killed him to silence him. And when he couldn't find where Thomas hid the ledger, he created the debt story to legally seize your land and ensure nobody ever dug this box up. Cora fell back a step, sitting heavily on a snow-dusted boulder. Her hands flew to her mouth. Everything she had believed for the past year, the crippling shame of being a gambler's widow, the guilt of thinking her husband had squandered their son's future on cards, it was all a lie. Thomas hadn't been a tragic victim of an addiction. He had been a greedy fool playing a deadly game of extortion with a monster, and he had lost. Worse, he had left his wife and child sitting directly on top of the powder keg. He lied to me, Cora whispered, her voice cracking. Every time he rode out late. Every time he came back with gold, he said he won in a lucky hand. He was bleeding a murderer, and he left Leo and me to pay the price. Silas watched the devastation wash over her. He wanted to reach out, to pull her against his chest, and shield her from the ugly truth of the world. But the chasm he had dug between them the night before held him back. Instead, he closed the lockbox. He tucked the ledger securely inside his shirt, against his chest. He was a fool, Silas said, his voice hard, factual, and grounding. But he gave us the one thing Black is terrified of. We have the proof, Cora. Black doesn't want your land. He wants this book. And with it, we can hang him. Cora looked up at Silas. The shock in her eyes was slowly receding, replaced by something much darker. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. What remained was a cold, pure, unadulterated fury. Gideon Black had murdered her husband. He had slaughtered her dog. He had terrified her child. He had forced her into a corner where she had to sell her life to a stranger just to survive the winter. Cora stood up. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had just realized she was holding a loaded gun to the head of the man who ruined her life. We don't wait for him to come back, Cora said, her voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register that made the hairs on the back of Silas's neck stand up. We take this to the sheriff. The sheriff is in Black's pocket, Silas reminded her, tapping the spot on his chest where the ledger lay. His name is in the book. I know, Cora said, her eyes flashing with a terrifying brilliance. That's exactly why we take it to him. We show him the noose, and we tell him he can either put it around Black's neck, or we put it around his. Silas stared at her. The sheer, audacious bravery of the plan took his breath away. It was reckless. It was brilliant. It was exactly the kind of move a man like Gideon Black would never see coming from a widow. A slow, dark smile crept onto Silas Thorne's scarred face. Mrs. Thorne, Silas murmured, the title no longer a bitter formality but a badge of profound respect. I believe you are a far more dangerous woman than I gave you credit for. Cora met his gaze, the fiery tension between them flaring back to life, burning through the freezing cold of the canyon. Let's get my son home, she commanded, and then we go to war. The ride back from Dead Man's Gulch was a silent, grueling march against the dying light. By the time the heavy oak door of the Thorne cabin slammed shut behind them, sealing out the shrieking wind, the temperature had dropped low enough to crack a stone. Silas immediately built the hearth fire into a roaring blaze. He didn't say a word as he stripped Leo out of his freezing, snow-caked coat, wrapping the shivering boy in 3 heavy wool quilts and setting him in the armchair closest to the flames. Cora moved with the frantic, singular focus of a mother, heating a kettle of broth and rubbing her son's icy hands until the color slowly began to return to his small knuckles. Only when Leo's teeth stopped chattering, his eyes drooping heavily as the warmth finally seeped into his bones, did the reality of what they had found in the canyon fully settle over the cabin. Silas stood by the kitchen table. The iron lockbox sat dead center on the scarred pine wood, its broken hasp a testament to the shattered lies of Cora's past. He pulled the leather-bound ledger from his coat. The book felt unnaturally heavy in his hands, weighted with blood, betrayal, and the undeniable power to tear Rust Valley apart. He flipped through the pages one last time, his jaw locked. Then he closed the ledger with a sharp, definitive thud, pulled his heavy gun belt from the back of a chair, and began strapping it over his hips. "I'll leave the Winchester with you," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for debate. He checked the action on his twin Colts, his movements fluid and deadly. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone, not even if you hear someone screaming for help. Black's men use tricks to draw people out." Cora stopped stirring the broth. She set the wooden spoon down with a sharp clack against the iron stove. She turned around, wiping her hands on her apron, her dark eyes narrowing. "And exactly where do you think you're going?" she asked. "To town," Silas replied, not looking up as he grabbed a handful of extra cartridges from a wooden box and shoved them into the pockets of his duster. "I'm paying a visit to Sheriff Miller. I'm going to shove this ledger down his throat and tell him he has exactly 1 hour to ride out to Black's compound with an arrest warrant, or I bypass him completely and ride for the federal marshal outpost in Denver." "No, you aren't," Cora said. Silas froze, a cartridge halfway to his pocket. He looked up, his pale blue eyes flashing. "Cora, this isn't a discussion." "You're right, it's not," she fired back, stepping away from the stove and crossing the room to stand directly in front of him. She didn't flinch at his towering height or the gun strapped to his thighs. "You ride into Rust Valley right now, Silas, and you'll be dead before your boots hit the boardwalk. I can handle Black's men." "It's not just Black's men." Cora's voice rose, vibrating with a fierce protective urgency. "It's the whole town. Miller is on the payroll. Half the deputies are on the payroll. They are terrified of Gideon Black, and they are terrified of you. If Silas Thorne comes riding into town with his guns loaded, looking for a fight, Miller will have a dozen rifles pointed at you from the rooftops before you even tie your horse. They'll shoot you in the back and claim you came to murder the law." Silas's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. His reputation was a shield, but it was also a weapon his enemies could use against him. A massive, heavily armed loner riding into town looking furious was the perfect excuse for a legally sanctioned execution. "I am not sitting here waiting for Black to burn us out, Cora," Silas growled, leaning forward, the sheer physical intensity of his presence radiating in the small room. "I know," Cora said, her voice dropping, matching his intensity not with aggression but with absolute terrifying calm. "That's why I am going." Silas stared at her as if she had just lost her mind. "The hell you are." "I am going," Cora repeated, stepping even closer, forcing him to look down into her eyes. "They don't view me as a threat, Silas. To Sheriff Miller, I am just a desperate, bankrupt widow whose husband died a pathetic gambler. I am invisible to them. I can walk right into his office and nobody will draw a weapon on me." "It's a suicide mission, Cora. If Miller panics, he'll kill you to keep the ledger quiet." "He won't kill me because I'm not bringing the ledger." Cora turned back to the table. She pulled a single sheet of blank parchment from Silas's writing desk and picked up a charcoal pencil. With swift, precise strokes, she began to copy the most damning column from Thomas's records. Dates, cattle head counts, and Sheriff Miller's exact payoff amounts. "I am taking a single page," Cora explained, not looking up from her writing. "I'm going to tell Miller that the original book is hidden. I will tell him that if I'm not seen riding out of Rust Valley unharmed by sundown, A letter will be dispatched on the morning train to the governor." Silas watched her. The firelight danced over her features, illuminating the sharp, beautiful lines of her face. She was magnificent. She was entirely out of her mind, but she was magnificent. He felt a surge of something so profound and overwhelming in his chest that it threatened to cut off his air. It wasn't just desire. It was awe. "You're asking me to let you walk into a den of vipers alone," Silas said, his voice thick, rough with a sudden betraying emotion. "You're asking me to stay behind while you put your life on the line. I can't do that, Cora. I watched a woman die once because I wasn't there to stop the storm. I won't do it again." The raw, bleeding honesty of his words hit Cora like a physical blow. She stopped writing. She looked up at him, seeing the terrifying vulnerability behind his icy blue eyes. For 8 years, he had protected himself from exactly this kind of terror. She walked slowly back to him. She didn't argue. She simply reached out and rested her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his hammering heart. "You aren't letting me go out into a storm to die, Silas," she murmured softly, her thumb brushing the rough canvas of his shirt. "You are trusting me to fight alongside you. Thomas made a victim out of me. Gideon Black made a victim out of me. I am done being a victim. This is my fight as much as it is yours. Let me do this." Silas closed his eyes, his breath hitching as he felt the warmth of her hand seeping through his clothes. The instinct to lock the door, to throw her over his shoulder and hide her in the cellar until the war was over, was violent and overpowering. But he knew if he did that, he would break the very thing he had come to revere about her. He opened his eyes. He reached down to his boot, pulling a small, deadly, double-barreled Remington Derringer from a hidden sheath. He flipped the latch, ensuring 2.41 caliber rounds were loaded, and clicked it shut. He took her hand, the one resting on his chest, and pressed the cold steel of the gun into her palm. "Keep it in your coat pocket. Keep your hand on it the entire time you're in that office," Silas instructed, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "If Miller reaches for his gun, you don't warn him. You don't hesitate. You aim for the center of his chest and you pull the trigger twice. Do you understand me?" Cora gripped the small gun. The metal was cold, heavy with terrifying responsibility. "I understand." Silas reached out, his massive hands gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his eyes burning into hers. "If you aren't back by the time the sun hits the ridge, Cora, I am coming for you. And God help anyone in that town who stands in my way." "I'll be back," she promised. The ride into Rust Valley was a descent into a freezing hell. The wind had shifted, blowing straight down from the northern peaks, carrying with it the bitter, blinding bite of a true Colorado whiteout. The snow was falling so thick and fast that Cora could barely see the ears of her dun mare. The cold gnawed through her heavy wool coat, biting at her fingers and toes. But the fire burning in her veins kept her moving forward. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, the streets were entirely deserted. Doors were barred. Shutters were nailed closed against the impending blizzard. The only light bleeding into the white haze came from the Gold Dust saloon and the heavily frosted windows of the sheriff's office. Cora tied her horse to the hitching post outside the jailhouse. Her hands were numb, clumsy with the frozen leather reins, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, pushing the panic down into a dark, locked box inside her mind. She slipped her right hand into her coat pocket, her fingers wrapping tightly around the checkered grip of Silas's Derringer. She pushed the heavy wooden door open. The heat inside the office hit her like a physical wall, thick with the smell of cheap coffee, wet wool, and stale cigar smoke. The potbelly stove in the corner was glowing a dull cherry red. Sheriff Miller was sitting behind his scarred oak desk, his boots propped up, reading a week-old newspaper. He was a thick, heavy-set man with a florid face and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the cost of whoever walked into his room. He looked up, his brow furrowing in irritation at the gust of snow Cora had let in. When he recognized her, His expression shifted to a mask of practiced condescending pity. "Mrs. Vance," Miller said, slowly lowering his newspaper but not bothering to take his boots off the desk. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Thorne now. Awful weather to be riding out. Your new husband kick you out already?" Cora didn't rise to the bait. She kicked the door shut behind her, the heavy latch falling into place with a loud metallic clack. She walked slowly to the center of the room, stopping exactly 6 feet from his desk. "I prefer to keep my business brief, Sheriff," Cora said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She used her left hand to reach into her inner pocket, pulling out the folded piece of parchment she had written at the cabin. She tossed it onto his desk. It landed right on top of his newspaper. "I suggest you read that," Cora said. Miller sighed, an exaggerated sound of profound annoyance. "Mrs. Thorne, if this is another complaint about Gideon Black's men harassing your property lines, I've told you before. It's a civil land dispute. Until the courts rule on the validity of your husband's debts, my hands are tied." "Read it, Miller," she commanded. The sheer authority in her tone made the man blink. Frowning, he swung his boots off the desk. He picked up the parchment, his eyes scanning the charcoal script. Cora watched him carefully. She watched the exact moment his eyes hit the dates. She watched the color completely drain from his ruddy cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. She watched the vein in his temple begin to throb as he read his own name, tied to an exact sum of illicit gold. The silence in the office stretched, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miller slowly looked up. The condescending pity was entirely gone. In its place was the panicked, cornered look of a rat caught in a trap. "Where did you get this?" Miller's voice was barely a whisper. His hand instinctively twitched toward the heavy peacemaker holstered on his hip. Inside her coat pocket, Cora cocked the hammer of the derringer. The sharp click sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Miller froze. He looked down at her coat pocket, his eyes widening. "Take your hand off your gun, Sheriff, or I will put a bullet through your lung right now," Cora said, her voice as cold and steady as the ice outside. "I am a desperate widow with nothing left to lose. Do not test me." Miller slowly raised his hands, resting them flat on the desk. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the draft in the room. "Mrs. Thorne, Cora, you don't understand what you're dealing with. If Black finds out you have this—" "Gideon Black is a dead man," Cora interrupted, taking one step closer, her eyes burning with a righteous, terrifying fury. "He murdered my husband to cover up his rustling syndicate, and you helped him cover up the murder." "I didn't kill Thomas," Miller blurted out, his composure shattering. "I swear to God I didn't. Black's men did it. I just signed the coroner's report. He threatened my family, Cora. You know what Black is capable of." "I know exactly what he is capable of," Cora hissed. "And I know what you are. A coward who sold his badge for rustler's gold." "Where is the book?" Miller demanded, desperation bleeding into his tone. "If this is a copy, where is the ledger?" "Hidden," Cora lied flawlessly, not blinking. "And it will stay hidden so long as you do exactly what I say. If I am not seen riding out of this town in the next 10 minutes, or if any of Black's men ever set foot on Thornland again, that ledger goes on the 6 a.m. train to Denver, with a letter addressed directly to the federal marshals. They will descend on Rust Valley, and you will hang right beside Gideon Black." Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door, then back to the gun concealed in her pocket. "What do you want?" "I want Black arrested, today." "I can't," Miller hissed. "He has 20 heavily armed men at his compound. If I ride out there with a warrant, it's a slaughter." "Then you deputize Silas," Cora fired back. "You give him a badge, and you make it legal for him to defend our property with lethal force. You strip Black of his immunity in this town. You tell every deputy on your payroll that if they raise a weapon against my husband, the ledger goes public. You stand with us, Miller, or you hang with him. Choose." Miller stared at the woman before him. For years he had seen Cora Vance as a nuisance, a pathetic creature crying over spilled milk. Now he was looking at an executioner. He realized with a sinking dread that she wasn't bluffing. She would burn the whole town to the ground if it meant keeping her son safe. Slowly, shakily, Miller reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a tarnished tin star and pushed it across the desk along with a blank warrant of deputization. "Take it," Miller whispered, looking physically sick. "God help you both. Black won't let this stand. When he realizes you're putting the squeeze on me, he won't just try to scare you anymore. He'll come to wipe you off the map." "Let him try," Cora said. She picked up the badge and the paper with her left hand, keeping the derringer trained on him with her right. She backed slowly toward the door, never taking her eyes off the corrupt lawman. "If I see you or your deputies anywhere near our ranch, Miller, I won't bother with the marshals." "I'll shoot you myself." Cora threw open the door, stepping backward into the howling blizzard, and slammed it shut. The moment she was outside, the adrenaline crashed. Her knees buckled slightly, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. She leaned against the frozen wood of the hitching post, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had done it. She had looked the devil in the eye and forced him to blink. She gripped the cold tin star in her hand, a fierce, triumphant tear cutting a hot path down her frozen cheek. She wasn't a victim anymore. Silas was right. She was a partner. Cora scrambled up into the saddle, her fingers completely numb, and spurred the dun mare. "Come on, girl," she urged, leaning low over the horse's neck. "Let's go home." The ride back was infinitely worse. The whiteout had arrived in full force. The world had dissolved into a chaotic, swirling vortex of blinding white. The sky and the earth were indistinguishable. Cora had to trust the mare's instincts, giving the horse its head, praying the animal remembered the way back to the warm barn. Time lost all meaning. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, urging her to just close her eyes and rest. But the image of Leo's face by the fire, and Silas's intense protective eyes, kept her awake, kept her fighting. Finally, the mare's ears pricked forward. The horse picked up its pace, recognizing the familiar incline of the road leading up to the Thorne property. Cora wiped the accumulated ice from her eyelashes, squinting through the driving snow as they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley. Her breath stopped dead in her throat. Through the blinding curtain of white, a horrifying, brilliant glow painted the falling snow a violent shade of orange. Smoke. Thick, black, greasy smoke was pouring into the blizzard, carrying with it the unmistakable, sickening scent of burning pine and scorched earth. "No," Cora whispered, terror seizing her heart with icy claws. "No, no, no!" She kicked the mare violently in the flanks. The horse plunged down the treacherous, icy path at a reckless, breakneck gallop. As they burst through the tree line and into the clearing of the Thorne compound, the full scope of the nightmare revealed itself. The outer barn, the massive structure that held their winter hay reserves, was fully engulfed in roaring flames. The fire was so intense it was creating its own wind, melting the snow in a 50-foot radius, and sending showers of bright orange embers spiraling into the dark sky. But it wasn't the fire that made Cora scream. The yard was a battlefield. The snow was churned into a dark, muddy slush, violently stained with wide swaths of crimson. 2 horses lay dead near the corral. A man she didn't recognize, wearing a duster bearing the broken iron brand, was sprawled face down in the dirt, a massive exit wound in his back. The front door of the cabin was smashed completely off its iron hinges, hanging drunkenly from the frame. "Silas!" Cora screamed, throwing herself off the mare before the horse had even stopped moving. She hit the icy ground hard, scraping her hands raw, but she didn't feel the pain. She scrambled to her feet, drawing the derringer, her eyes darting wildly through the smoke. "Silas! Leo!" Nothing, only the roar of the flames. She ran toward the porch, the heat of the burning barn blistering her frozen skin. As she reached the steps, she saw him. Silas was slumped against the heavy wooden railing of the porch. His Winchester rifle was lying in the snow a few feet away, its stock splintered. His massive frame was folded over, his right hand gripping his side, blood pouring between his fingers in a terrifying, steady stream, staining the white snow a vibrant, horrific red. "Silas!" Cora dropped to her knees in the slush, her hands flying to his face. His skin was the color of ash, his breathing shallow and ragged. His pale blue eyes were hazy, struggling to focus on her face through the pain. "Cora!" he choked out, coughing weakly, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. I'm here, she sobbed, tearing her scarf from her neck and pressing it frantically against the gunshot wound in his side. "Silas, hold on. Where is he? Where is Leo?" Silas's hands shot out, his blood-slick fingers gripping her wrist with a sudden, desperate strength. The devastation in his eyes was absolute. It was the look of a man who had faced his worst nightmare and lost. "I tried," Silas rasped, his voice breaking, tears of pure agony mixing with the melting snow on his face. "There were too many. They ambushed from the tree line." "Silas, where is my son?" Cora demanded, her voice cracking, shaking him gently. Silas swallowed hard, his head falling back against the wooden post. "Black," Silas whispered, his eyes closing as the blood loss finally dragged him toward the dark. Black took him. He took the boy, Cora. He took him into the storm. The wind howled, a deafening shriek of triumph as the blizzard swallowed the Thorn Ranch whole. The wind shrieked through the broken hinges of the front door, scattering snow and dead ashes across the floorboards of the ruined cabin. Cora didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the bruises blooming on her knees or the raw, scraped skin of her palms. She hooked her arms under Silas's massive shoulders, her boots slipping in the bloody slush on the porch, and dragged him over the threshold with a guttural cry of sheer adrenaline-fueled exertion. He was incredibly heavy, his dead weight threatening to pull them both to the floor, but Cora hauled him to the center of the sitting room and eased him onto the canvas-draped sofa. "Silas, Silas, keep your eyes open," Cora commanded, her voice cracking as she tore her coat off and threw it aside. She ripped the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of his shirt away from his side. The bullet had caught him just above the hip bone. It was an ugly, jagged tear, pouring dark blood. But as she frantically felt along his lower back, her blood-stained fingers found the exit wound. "It went clean through," she gasped, a sob of relief finally tearing from her throat. "It didn't hit anything vital. I can stop the bleeding." Silas didn't answer. His head was tipped back against the sofa, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the ceiling. But he wasn't looking at the wooden rafters. His chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and frantic. The cabin was freezing, the roar of the blizzard filling the room, identical to the sound that had haunted his nightmares for 8 years. "The snow," Silas choked out, his voice a hollow, terrified rasp. His massive hands began to tremble violently. "It's too deep. I can't see the tracks. She's out there. I have to find her." Cora grabbed a clean linen sheet, tearing it into thick strips with her teeth and hands, and pressed a heavy wad of cloth directly against the bleeding hole in his side. Silas flinched, but his eyes didn't focus on her. He was spiraling. The physical trauma of the gunshot combined with the howling whiteout outside had violently, forcefully dragged him back in time. He was no longer the hardened, untouchable rancher of Rust Valley. He was the desperate, broken man losing his wife to the ice. "Silas, no. Stay with me," Cora pleaded, pressing her weight onto the wound to staunch the flow. "I'm sorry," Silas whispered to the empty air, tears cutting tracks through the soot and blood on his face. "I tried to get back. The pass was blocked. Anna, I'm sorry." Cora's heart shattered at the raw, bleeding agony in his voice. He was breaking apart right in front of her. If he surrendered to the ghosts now, he would die on this sofa, and Gideon Black would disappear into the mountains with her son. She needed the warrior back. Cora let go of the bandages with one hand. She reached up, grabbed Silas by the jaw, and forced his face toward hers. Her grip was bruising, fierce and completely unyielding. "Look at me," she shouted over the wind. Silas blinked, his hazy blue eyes slowly focusing on her face. "My name is Cora," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady cadence that cut through his panic like a hot knife. "I am not Anna. I am right here. You are not trapped in the past, Silas Thorne. You are here, in the present, and my son is out there in that storm." Silas stared at her. The violent trembling in his hands began to slow. Cora leaned closer, her dark eyes burning with an intensity that rivaled the blazing fire of the burning barn outside. "Gideon Black took Leo. He took my boy because he knows I have the ledger. He thinks he's broken us. He thinks you're going to bleed to death on this floor, and I'm going to surrender." She reached into her pocket. Her fingers, slick with his blood, pulled out the tarnished tin star she had taken from Sheriff Miller. She slammed the badge onto Silas's chest right over his heart. "I didn't ride into a den of vipers today to watch you give up," Cora hissed, her voice vibrating with absolute terrifying authority. "You are deputized. You are the law in this valley tonight, and I am your partner. We are going to pack this wound. We are going to load every gun in this house, and we are going to get my son back. Do you hear me?" The ghost of the past wavered, and then, under the sheer, blinding force of her will, it shattered. The haze cleared from Silas's eyes. The terror evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating, and utterly lethal clarity. The warrior was back. "Bind it tight," Silas growled, his jaw locking against the pane. "As tight as you can pull it." Cora didn't hesitate. She wrapped the linen strips around his waist, pulling the makeshift tourniquet so viciously tight that Silas grunted in pain. She tied it off, knotting it twice. Silas forced himself up. He swayed for a fraction of a second, his face pale from blood loss, but he locked his knees and stood his ground. He walked to the gun cabinet near the fireplace. The glass was shattered from the shootout, but the weapons inside were untouched. He pulled out a heavy double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun and cracked the action, shoving 2 massive brass shells into the breech. He tossed it onto the table. Next, he checked his twin Colts, reloading the spent chambers with rapid mechanical precision. He turned to Cora. He walked over to where his Winchester lay in the snow just beyond the doorway. He picked it up. The wooden stock was heavily chipped by a grazing bullet, but the lever action and the blued steel barrel were perfectly intact. He wiped the snow from the iron sights and held the rifle out to her. "You take the Winchester," Silas said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. "Black has a 10-minute head start. A group that size riding through a whiteout with a hostage, they won't try to clear the mountain pass. They'll head for shelter to wait out the worst of the storm, or wait for me to bleed out." "Where?" Cora asked, racking the lever to check the chamber. The metallic clack sounded like a death knell in the ruined cabin. "The old mining camp at the base of the Weeping Ridge," Silas said, strapping his gun belt tightly over the bloody bandages. "It's 3 miles north. The cabins are rotted, but it has a defensible gorge. That's where he'll hunker down." Cora grabbed an extra bandolier of rifle cartridges from the cabinet and slung it diagonally across her chest, over her heavy coat. She shoved the Derringer back into her pocket. She looked entirely different from the desperate widow he had met in town weeks ago. She looked like an avenging angel. Silas picked up the shotgun. He looked at her, the undeniable weight of what they were about to do hanging between them. "They won't expect us to follow them into a whiteout," Silas said softly. "It's suicide to ride in this weather." "Then it's a good thing we're already dead to them," Cora replied coldly. Silas Thorne finally let a dark, terrifying smile touch his lips. He reached out, his bloody hand wrapping around the back of her neck, and pulled her forehead against his for one brief, grounding second. "Let's go hunt," he whispered. The blizzard was a living, breathing monster. It fought them for every inch of ground. The snow was knee-deep on the horses, and the wind shrieked with a deafening, chaotic roar that stripped the heat from their bodies. Silas led the way, relying entirely on his intimate, decade-long knowledge of the land. He didn't navigate by sight. He navigated by the feel of the incline beneath his gelding's hooves and the direction of the biting wind against his face. Cora followed in his wake, her dun mare struggling to keep pace. She kept her head down, her gloved hand resting protectively over the action of the Winchester to keep the snow from freezing the mechanism. Her mind was a singular burning focus. Leo. 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 After an hour of agonizing, freezing progress, the terrain began to narrow. The wind funneled fiercely through a steep, rocky gorge. Silas held up a fist. He dismounted, ignoring the sharp spike of agony in his side, and waded back through the waist-high snowdrift to Cora. He pulled her down from the saddle, motioning for her to leave the horses tied to a thick stand of dead pines. The wind was too loud for whispers. He had to lean in, his mouth inches from her ear. "The camp is just over this rise," Silas yelled over the gale. "4 structures. They'll have guards posted, but the visibility is barely 20 feet. The snow is our cover." Cora nodded, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached, but she gripped the Winchester tighter. "Listen to me," Silas continued, his pale eyes burning into hers. "I am going to circle around through the creek bed and come up right through the center of the camp. I will draw their fire. I will make sure every gun they have is pointed at me." "No!" Cora grabbed his coat. "You're bleeding. If you walk into the center—" "I am the bait, Cora," Silas interrupted, his voice absolute. He gripped her shoulders. "You take the ridge on the right. It overlooks the main bunkhouse. When they come out after me, you find Black. You find Leo. You do not shoot to suppress. You shoot to kill." Cora stared at him. He was asking her to watch him walk into a firing squad so she could get the sniper's angle. It was a tactical, ruthless, heartbreakingly practical plan. "Silas?" she choked, the terror for him finally piercing her armor. "I promised you wouldn't spend another winter alone," Silas vowed, his voice a low, fiercely protective rasp against her ear. "I intend to keep my word. Get to the high ground." Before she could argue, he turned and vanished into the swirling curtain of white. Cora stood alone for a terrifying second. Then she forced her frozen legs to move. She trudged up the steep, icy embankment on the right side of the gorge. Her boots slipped, her knees slamming against hidden rocks. But she clawed her way to the top. She crawled on her belly through the deep powder, reaching the crest of the ridge. Below her, barely visible through the driving snow, were the dark, skeletal outlines of the abandoned mining camp. Dim yellow light flickered from the gaps in the boarded-up windows of the largest cabin. Cora brushed the snow from the barrel of the Winchester. She nestled the heavy wooden stock into her shoulder, laying flat on the freezing rock, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate just as Silas had taught her on the practice range. Crack! The sound of a snapping branch echoed faintly from the bottom of the camp. 2 men emerged from the shadows of the smaller cabins, their rifles raised, peering into the blizzard. They couldn't see anything in the whiteout. Suddenly, a massive shadow detached itself from the blinding snow right behind them. Silas Thorne moved with the terrifying, silent speed of an apex predator. He didn't use his guns. The flash would give away his position too early. He swung the heavy wooden stock of the 10-gauge shotgun like a club, catching the first man squarely in the jaw with a sickening crunch. The man dropped like a stone. The second guard spun around, opening his mouth to yell. Silas's Bowie knife flashed in the dim light, driving up and under the man's ribs. The guard slumped silently into the snowdrift. Silas pulled his blade free, stepping over the bodies, his eyes locked on the main bunkhouse door. But a third man, stepping out to relieve the watch, saw him. "Thorne's here!" the man bellowed, raising his revolver. The element of surprise was gone. The camp erupted. Silas dropped the knife, whipped the 10-gauge up to his hip, and pulled the trigger. The thunderous roar of the buckshot tore through the storm, blowing the guard backward off the porch. Instantly, the door to the main bunkhouse was kicked open. 4 more men poured out, firing blindly into the snow. Silas dove behind a rusted ore cart as bullets chewed into the wood and iron around him. He dropped the empty shotgun, drawing his twin Colts. He popped up from cover, firing a rapid, devastating volley. His accuracy was inhuman. Two more of Black's men went down, screaming, clutching their chests and legs. Up on the ridge, Cora tracked the chaos through the iron sights of the Winchester. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but she couldn't risk a shot in the swirling melee. She was waiting for one man. Down below, Silas clicked on empty cylinders. He ducked back behind the ore cart, his hands moving frantically to reload, but his movements were sluggish. His left side was completely numb, the makeshift bandages soaked through with fresh blood. "Hold your fire!" A booming, arrogant voice commanded over the wind. The shooting stopped. Through the front door of the bunkhouse stepped Gideon Black. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man in a heavy fur-lined coat, his face a mask of aristocratic cruelty. And in front of him, held tightly by the collar of his coat with a heavy Colt revolver pressed directly to his temple, was Leo. "Mama!" Leo screamed, struggling against the man's grip, his face streaked with tears and soot. Up on the ridge, Cora's heart stopped. She shifted the rifle, putting the iron sights dead center on Gideon Black's chest. But the wind was howling, and Black was keeping Leo positioned perfectly in front of his vital organs. If the wind pushed her bullet an inch to the left, she would hit her own son. She couldn't take the shot. "Step out, Thorn!" Black yelled into the snow. "Step out where I can see you, or I scatter the boy's brains in the snow right now." Behind the ore cart, Silas closed his eyes. He spat a mouthful of blood into the snow. He holstered his empty Colts. Slowly, heavily, Silas Thorne stood up and stepped out from behind cover. He held his empty hands out to his sides, standing completely exposed in the center of the camp. Black laughed, a cruel, victorious sound. The great Silas Thorne, brought low by a widow and a bastard kid. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had a weak spot." "Let the boy go, Black," Silas said, his voice carrying a calm, deadly resonance. "You have me, you don't need him." "Oh, I'll let him go," Black sneered, cocking the hammer of the gun pressed to Leo's head. "Right after I put a bullet in your gut and let him watch you freeze to death. Then I'm going to find his mother, and I'm going to make her beg before I burn the ledger and her with it." Silas didn't look at Black's gun. He looked at Leo. "Close your eyes, kid," Silas said softly. Leo sobbed, squeezing his eyes shut. Black aimed his revolver squarely at Silas's chest. "Any last words, Thorne?" Up on the ridge, Cora stopped breathing. She remembered the freezing yard. She remembered Silas's massive hands guiding hers, his low voice murmuring in her ear. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Wait for the wind to drop." The howling gale died for one singular miraculous heartbeat. The curtain of snow parted just enough. Black had moved his arm away from Leo's head to aim at Silas, exposing his side. Cora didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, a massive gout of fire spitting from the barrel. Down in the camp, Gideon Black's chest exploded. The heavy .44-40 bullet tore through his fur coat, spinning him violently around. His gun discharged wildly into the dirt as he collapsed backward, hitting the snow dead before he even realized what had happened. Leo screamed, dropping to his knees. The remaining two guards stared at their dead boss in utter shock. They didn't even have time to raise their weapons before Silas was on them. Silas drew his Bowie knife from his boot in a blur of motion, driving the hilt into the temple of the nearest man, knocking him unconscious. The last guard dropped his rifle, threw his hands in the air, and ran blindly into the blizzard, screaming in terror. The camp fell dead silent, save for the whistling wind. "Leo!" Cora scrambled down the icy ridge, sliding on her backside, tearing her coat, abandoning the rifle in the snow. She hit the bottom of the gorge and ran across the blood-stained camp, throwing herself onto her knees in the snow. She snatched Leo up, burying her face in his neck, rocking him frantically. I have you, baby, you're safe." Leo clung to her, sobbing hysterically into her coat. Cora looked up through her tears. Silas was standing a few feet away. He was staring down at Gideon Black's lifeless body. Slowly, the adrenaline began to leave his system, replaced by the crushing, agonizing reality of his blood loss. He looked up at Cora and Leo. A faint, genuine smile touched his pale, scarred face. Then, Silas Thorne's eyes rolled back in his head, his knees buckled, and he collapsed face first into the snow. The blizzard did not break them. It broke against them. Cora had not let him die in the snow. When Silas had collapsed in the ruined mining camp, she had bound his wound with strips of her own coat, hoisted his massive unconscious frame over the saddle of the dun mare, and walked him out of the freezing hell with Leo clutching her hand. She had kept him breathing until the storm broke the next morning and the town doctor could be forced at gunpoint to ride up the mountain. She had fought for him with the same ferocious, unyielding spirit she had used to fight Gideon Black. Now, 4 months later, the ice of Rust Valley was finally surrendering to the sun. Spring had arrived with a fierce, brilliant vengeance. The snowmelt roared down the granite cliffs, turning the creeks into rushing veins of life. The air smelled of damp earth, blooming sage, and the clean, sharp scent of pine. Down in the valley, the town was breathing again. The arrival of the federal marshals, summoned by the ledger Cora had safely guarded, had swept through the county like a scythe. Sheriff Miller had been hauled out of his own jailhouse in heavy iron shackles, weeping like a child. The rustling syndicate was dismantled, Black's remaining men scattered to the winds or swinging from the gallows in Denver. For the first time in a year, Cora Vance's land was safe. But she hadn't moved back to her cabin. Silas stood on the high ridge overlooking the Thorne Ranch, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. He didn't strictly need the cane anymore. The jagged bullet hole through his side had knit into a thick, silvery scar, but his left leg still twinged when the morning air was crisp. He wasn't looking down at the newly rebuilt outer barn, or the fortified corral where Leo was currently trying to lasso a wooden fence post with entirely too much enthusiasm. He was looking down at the small, weathered wooden cross at his feet. The snow had melted from the grave, revealing the dark, rich soil of the mountain. Tiny shoots of green grass were already pushing their way through the dirt. Silas reached up to the collar of his shirt. For 8 years, he had worn a heavy leather cord around his neck. Strung on it was a small silver mourning ring. It had felt like a millstone, a constant freezing reminder of his failure, his grief, and his penance. He unknotted the leather cord. The wind ruffled his dark hair as he knelt slowly in the damp grass, his bad side protesting slightly. He rested his scarred, calloused hand on the top of the wooden cross. "I kept the cold out as long as I could, Anna," Silas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried no bitterness, only a profound, settling peace. "I built the walls. I lived in the dark." He looked down toward the cabin. Plumes of white smoke curled happily from the stone chimney. "But she brought the fire," Silas whispered, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "She saved my life, and she saved my soul. I think you would have liked her." He didn't ask for forgiveness, because he finally understood he didn't need it. Anna hadn't wanted him to die with her in that storm. Silas pressed the silver ring deep into the thawed, soft earth at the base of the cross, burying it where it belonged. He patted the soil flat, stood up, and took a deep, lung-expanding breath of the crisp mountain air. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for nearly a decade was gone. He turned his back to the graveyard and began the walk down the hill. He was going home. When Silas pushed open the heavy oak door of the cabin, he didn't step into a mausoleum. He stepped into a sanctuary. The white canvas sheets were long gone. The pine floors were swept clean, the windows thrown open to let the spring breeze chase out the last of the winter staleness. The smell of fresh yeast-risen bread and roasting venison filled the room. "Leo," Silas called out, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. The boy scrambled down from the loft, his boots thumping loudly on the wooden rungs. He wasn't the terrified, shivering child clutching a rusted rifle anymore. He was a rancher's son, his face sunburned, his eyes bright with life. "Yes, sir?" Leo asked, snapping to attention with a grin. The new roan foal needs brushing down. Take your time with him. He's skittish. Leo beamed, grabbing his coat from the hook. I can do it, Mr. Thorne. I'll get him real gentle. The boy bolted out the front door, leaving it slightly ajar to the beautiful morning. Silas turned his attention to the kitchen. Cora was standing by the stone hearth, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She wore a simple pale yellow dress that caught the morning sunlight, her dark hair pinned loosely up, a few soft curls escaping to frame her face. She looked up as he walked in, her dark eyes instantly finding his, reading the subtle shift in his posture, the lightness in his step. She saw that the leather cord was missing from his neck. Her breath caught perfectly still in her throat. She didn't move as Silas crossed the room, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots echoing on the floorboards. He didn't stop at the edge of the kitchen. He walked right into her space, towering over her, his massive presence entirely encompassing but no longer intimidating. It was a shelter. He reached out. His large, heavily scarred hands, rough from years of breaking horses and building fences, came up to gently frame her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones with a reverence that made Cora's heart hammer wildly against her ribs. The survival pact is fulfilled, Mrs. Thorne, Silas said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rumble that sent a shiver straight down her spine. Gideon Black is gone. Miller is gone. Your land is safe, and your debts are cleared. Cora looked up into his pale, piercing blue eyes. The ice in them had completely melted, replaced by a burning, terrifyingly beautiful heat. So, Cora whispered, her hands slowly coming up to rest flat against his solid, fiercely beating chest. What happens now? Silas smiled. It wasn't a dark smirk or a grimace of survival. It was a real, sweeping, breathtaking smile that transformed his rugged face completely. He leaned down, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers, his breath warm against her skin. Now I'm asking you, Silas murmured, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. Do you want a contract, or do you want a real husband for every winter after this one? A tear of pure, blinding joy spilled over Cora's lashes. She slid her hands up over his broad shoulders, tangling her fingers deep into the dark hair at the nape of his neck. I want you, she breathed. Only you. Silas didn't give her a chance to say another word. He crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a kiss born of desperation or adrenaline like the one in the freezing barn. It was a kiss of absolute, undeniable possession. It was sweeping, passionate, and infinitely deep, sealing a promise written not in ink, but in blood, fire, and survival. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, lifting her clean off the floorboards, pulling her flush against his chest as she kissed him back with everything she had. Outside the open door, the snow continued to melt into the thirsty earth of Rust Valley. But inside the Thorne cabin, the fire was roaring, the ghosts were gone, and the winter was finally permanently over.